Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Adam Steele for Hot Post Studios, and today I have a very special guest on the channel. Let me introduce you to Mr. David Gnozzi from MixbusTV. How are you?
How are you, man? Thank you for having me, Adam.
Anytime. You are very welcome. For a lot of my viewers, I would imagine a lot of you have seen MixbusTV. David is a very busy, very successful mixing and mastering engineer. I tend to work mostly with the rock and metal, and David does a lot of that as well, but you also work with pretty much anything, right? I've seen you do things, courses even for hip-hop and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. You said it. Absolutely everything. Right now, I just finished a mix for the rap priestess, Lizzie Jeff. Very amazing artist, hip-hop artist from Atlanta. I have a dance hall album to master. I finished a rock and roll song, which is the one we use for the chorus. Literally everything lands on my desk for any genre. The previous course was on metal, so it was like literally everything.
That's amazing. And that must keep you fresh when you work between genres, so you really kind of have your finger on the pulse of the kind of modern sound, I guess?
Absolutely. I think it's very helpful, and I feel blessed that I get to work on so many different genres, because I think one of the things that happens naturally, at least for me, is you start blending techniques and sounds and contaminating one genre with the other. You know, maybe your hip hop beat hits a little more hard than another hip hop engineer would, because I just came from a metal album or from a rock album, you know, or some vocal effects I use on this track called New Moon for the band The Nest, which is like Massive Attack style. So you maybe find yourself picking some of those ethereal effects and put it in a hip hop track, which is not common. So I think if an engineer doesn't have the chance to work on different genres, I think it's very beneficial to listen to all kinds of genre, even the stuff you not necessarily like.
Absolutely. I do like to keep fresh. Some of the bands that I work with do all sorts of weird genres. It's great. But just to come back to what we're supposed to talk about specifically today, David does quite a few courses with Pro Mix Academy and Produce Like a Pro and Warren's whole stable. And there's a new course which is focusing quite a lot on modern rock and your approach to not just using analog or not just using digital, but kind of the hybrid of both. So let's start with the basics for you of how do you marry the two of those?
Well, I started with analog. My career, I started when the transition between full analog and digital was start happening. I started on big board, but the tape machine was off. You know, we had the computer already. So I was introduced to this world when there was already a hybrid system, mostly analog. And for me, over time, I started collecting a lot of gear. In the studio that I had prior this one, I had about 48 to 50 channels of hardware. And then I started realizing that plugins got really good. There's no debate. And I was able to cut some of the hardware out and integrate with plugins. So, you know, my hardware collection got a little smaller, but the selection of the hardware pieces that I have, for me, they are still irreplaceable. They still do something that you can't do with plugins. You can't get there, or maybe you can, but it takes you a week longer. And when you're a professional mix engineer, a week longer is not going to happen, because, you know, the client's going to get pissed that you make less money because you can mix less. So, but it's no debate that hardware and plugin is not anymore a matter of what worse and better. It's a matter of workflow. It's a matter of how you use it. And it's a matter of, like, for example, for me, how do you integrate the two? Because it's true that there are some piece of gear on my desk and on my racks that I can't replicate with plugins. But at the same time, I have plugins that are able to do some crazy effects, or even just being so precise, or automations and stuff like that hardware will never do. There is not even a piece of hardware that, you know, does some crazy effects. I can't think of something like that right now, but you got what I mean. Like, they are the best at what they do. They don't do the same. They simply don't do the same thing, you know.
Yeah, there is some really cool stuff. I mean, I've started using a plugin called Gullfoss. Do you know Gullfoss?
Yeah, I actually reviewed the plugin for them.
Yeah, and yeah. So and it doesn't do something that I've ever seen anything analog do. So that's a perfect example.
No, not at all. The Matthew, I can think of the Matthew Lane, the Dr. MS. There are some hardware that have stereo manipulation, and it sounds amazing. For example, my SSL Fusion, but you can't get that precise like in that one plugin, or, you know, bandpass the mono signal that then you're gonna stereoize. You can do some tricks with that plugin that there's no hardware for it. So yeah, there are some gems out there.
And then there's always that crossover, isn't there? When there's certain EQs, certain preamps, compressors. At what point do you decide we don't need the hardware anymore, let's use the plugin? Is there some special secret sauce, feel? What is it that makes you decide?
No, I think I don't think that way. I think more like, because I have a selection of hardware, I know where I want the hardware. So the rest is kind of a consequence of that. You know, I know that I want, for example, a distressor on lead vocals. I know that I want those 3 pieces on my 2 bus. And then I leave maybe 2-3 compressors or a couple of EQs free for whatever. But it really depends on the song. Any given song will tell you what's the most important element, you know, in it, and then you decide, okay, so maybe I use a plugin because it has these kind of effects, and I want to feature that vocals in that way. I can think of like maybe some sampling EDM, or some ethereal reverbs, like in that track that I mentioned before, the New Moon one that has a shimmer reverb that is awesome, is Valhalla reverb. I can't think of any, you know, hardware that does that kind of reverb. It's amazing. At the same time, you know, there's some, I think more on the side of heavy-handed compression or saturation analog vibe. Like, again, I have my West audio gear, my distressors, my drummer stuff for the Heritage. They have like a germanium compressor like the Heritage. It's hard to get that same vibe that quickly with plugin, because that's another big point for me. For a professional mix engineer, how fast you are is important, because you have turnaround, because you have deadlines, because you have clients, you know, and maybe you have 2 songs going at the same time, or 3, and someone wants a revision. You have to, you know, you need to be fast. When you're a professional mix engineer, you need to be fast. When you're at home mixing your own stuff, that doesn't really make sense unless you have a deadline and have a deal with a distributor or a label. You know, you have all the time in the world, so you can spend time on your stuff. Even though I think that it's always better to try to be fast and give yourself a deadline, even if you don't have one, because you start fucking around otherwise. You know, and trying like every single plugin that you have on that vocal until you find the one. So it's always good to give yourself a deadline. But yeah, it's a different approach when you mix for clients and when you mix for yourself. So with hardware, I'm still faster for some things.
Well, there's a good question to ask, is that if you've got this kind of hybrid approach, let's say it is definitely faster mixing with the analog stuff that works for you. Is it still faster when you have to do recall after recall after recall?
No. No, and that's why well, I don't have them here now, but that's why I have 4 distressors, for example, because I was using them so much that if I had to do a recall, I don't want to do a recall. I'll keep 2 for one song, 2 for another. I don't recall. I just switch. And it's expensive, of course, but that again makes sense only if you do this for a living, you know? And on the same subject, I love West Audio gear because it's fully analog, digitally controlled. So each I have 4 pieces of them from them, and they just work as a plugin. You have a plugin interface and you recall automatically. Every other piece, almost every other piece on my desk is either dented or, you know, the few are not. So I keep that in mind when I put desk in my gear. I keep the recall part, although I don't get many revisions, usually none or 1 or 2, but I do keep that in mind, of course, because recall is a bitch.
Yeah.
There's no way around it. But I hope that, and I think it's going to happen, the future is going to be where Wes Audio started to go. So full analog, digitally recalled. I recently did a video for Neve, for AMS Neve, on their Genesis console. And that's like every mix engineer wet dream is a full analog Neve console, completely, you know, digitally recallable. So it's like, you know, amazing. And many companies are going that way because I think we all understand that hardware is here to stay, but at the same time, the conveniency of plugins opening as many instances as you want and instant recall when you open a session, it's a big selling point, definitely a big selling point. So I think the hardware manufacturers are, you know, catching up with that and going in that direction. We'll see a lot. I can't say, but I know some product right now. I'm NDA. I'm gagged. I can't say anything, but I know they will. Some products in that fashion are going to come. So it's going to be interesting to see what's happening.
I think the whole industry is going to go that way because, you know, digitally controlled analog equipment. I think we're at the point now where it's going to become affordable quite soon. Because I mean, some of that stuff's been available. Like there's companies like Better Maker that have made stuff like that for a while, but the price, like a stereo EQ, might be $4,000 or $5,000.
Yeah.
A lot of us don't have that money to spend just on an EQ. You know, you might spend that on the desk, unless you are top tier. But let's focus more on the course then. So this, I believe it's quite an in-depth course. It's quite a long course where you talk through every little thing.
It's a 15-part course. Is mixing and mastering modern rock, and this one is, I think, interesting and definitely different from the other courses that I have on the Academy. This is my 4th, because instead of mixing the track, which was for a client, shout out to the band Stone Breed, the song is called The Whiskey. Instead of mixing the track and then breaking down the mix, which is, you know, something that I did in the previous courses or in YouTube videos or something like that, I actually filmed the actual mixing from start to finish. So I think it's interesting because you're gonna see not just what worked, but also what didn't work and why, you know. And by that I mean maybe you tried something on, you know, on the mix for 20 minutes and then you go like, nope, that's not the way, just scratch that and redo that. Or maybe you see me using a compressor on a certain element for the first 2 hours of mixing, and then at some point some other elements changes, it comes in the mix, it sounds different, that one doesn't work anymore. So I think it's going to be interesting because of that, because you actually see a non-sugar coated mixing for a client with over 90 tracks of audio, and by the time that was done, they were almost double that, because you start adding effects and you start adding parallel channels and stuff. You end up with almost double the tracks. So I think that is going to be interesting because of that. You see the raw mixing process with all the headache that gives you a big project like that.
There's a lot of headache. I mean, I think what a lot of people don't get with tutorials where it's really cleanly edited down is there is no one magic solution for every little thing, because each part of the mix changes the other parts of the mix, right?
Absolutely, and that's another interesting point when we talk about mixing with hybrid, not just analog. By a lot of people always ask me, like, why do you have 4 distress, or why do you need 4? Like, you have 1 print, vocals and, bass and stuff. And that's the point, because it doesn't work that way,
Yeah.
I wish it doesn't work that way. When you need a certain machine, when you mix with hybrid, all the units, they just work as a regular plugin. You don't print your plugin and then, put it on the other track. Everything needs to run at the same time when the mix has all the elements open, and you need to adjust as you go while listening everything. So if you have a compressor on a bass and then one on a vocal, you need to adjust while they're both going, and so definitely it's a working process. You see the mix slowly changing from a demo to a record, and I want to stress the word slowly. You don't see like, oh, here's the bass, let's do this trick, and the bass is done. No.
Yeah.
The bass is done after day number 2 or day number 3, along with everything else.
Right.
So you don't mix in solo, you don't focus too much on elements. It's just is a mix. The mix is what's important. Nobody cares or will ever listen to your tracks in solo. I think that's one of the mistakes that I see a lot from newbies. No offense, but like, you can spend 5 hours to make your kick sound like a diamond, perfect, and then you open a mix and the kick disappears. I'm pretty sure this happened to a lot of people. That's why, because you need to, and I think it's because with digital we have so much control that we start to be a little bit of a control freak, and you want everything. You want that sound to sound perfect. And Andy Wallace, my most favorite mix engineer of all times, once said, a mix is a combination of imperfect elements. So not every single track can sound pretty,
Yeah. It's funny, a lot of the mixes that I do, I will afterwards go back and talk about things, because I tend to do like question sections with viewers afterwards, and we'll solo a track and you go, oh, that doesn't sound good. But then you go, well, but it works. And it's always really interesting to see how you come to those conclusions, especially when it's the full process and you can see at every point. It's like, well, it started off sounding this way, then we got it to sound this way, then we changed it again, and now it works.
Yeah, it's every element works in synergy, and that's the way to mix, and it's a process. It's never one trick. It's never, the same kind of processing on that given track. Like, what do you use on vocals? I don't know. It depends what day and what song and what's around the vocal, and that's why I always say mix is not easy. It's not, and it takes years, so whoever wants to learn better, get comfortable, because it takes a little bit.
Yeah. So this is a fascinating course that's all analog and digital, but one of the issues of the course like this is that you've got all this nice analog gear, and everybody else doesn't. So yes, I believe there's a clever solution to this.
Yes, I actually thought about this while I was doing the course, and first of all, I tried to contain myself and not use like 40 units on the mix, of course, but I thought the same thing. Like, this is when for example, I had a distressor on a vocal. So this is pretty important for people to listen to the difference between with and without this compressor. And you can't really get there with plugins. That's why I have the real thing. So I thought, you know what? I will print for every track or stem where I use hardware. I will print the track with the hardware on, and then leave the processing, the other processing on available, so is inactive. So this solves the problem, because everybody who gets the course and doesn't have all the machines that I have, they can still hear the single stem, the single track processed with that piece of hardware. So they get the most important thing. How does it sound by itself and then in the mix? And they can try to replicate that with plugins, which might be possible. Like, you might actually, whether or not it's gonna be possible, it's gonna be a very, very good gym to try to get there without having that machine. That's how I learned. I didn't wake up one day and had all this gear. So at first I was hearing mixes from other people and was like, how do I get that sound? And you sit there for 2 days trying to get there with what you have. Doesn't matter what you have,
This is exactly where I was when I started learning. I think I'm a few years younger than you, that I started just after kind of the whole big analog board thing was not really something you could do anymore. So yeah, a lot of my recording experience was you might track in a nice studio, but then everything was just, here's Cubase or here's Pro Tools LE with the basic plugins, go. And because of that, you never really got a sense of what the nice analog equipment could do. So having that comparison, I think, is very important, that you can hear, this is the goal I should be aiming for. And David talks about you talk about why you chose this piece of gear on each thing, right? Because that's just as important. It's something I've come to learn, is it's not just I used a compressor, it's here's why I used this.
Yeah, and it's exactly what you will find in the course. Like for every element, I actually did that bit on purpose. So I tried several compressors. For lead vocals is arguably the most important element in a mix. So just because I thought it was very educational and I knew a lot of people wanted to see something like that, there's a bit in which I compare a bunch of my compressors on vocals so they can hear the difference and why I picked at the end the one I picked. And then they have the printed track. And exactly, you hit a very important point, I think. The A/B test between plugin versus hardware, between you and me, are pretty useless. And everybody who worked with analog knows that, because it's not a static setting. It's never something like that. And of course you can get an idea if the plugin is close, and some plugins really are close. But for people who never worked with hardware and analog, the problem is they don't have a reference point. And this goes both ways. Like, when you mix with analog for so many years, it's easier for you to mix in the box because you know how it's supposed to sound. You know what the goal is better than if you don't have any reference, And again, the A/B test will only tell you so much because the mix is a moving, living thing, and so is analog. When a machine, it's hotter, it sounds a little different than when you just turn it on, and it changes over the years. So I think it's important for people to have this kind of reference point and then go from there. I think it's a good way to learn. I wish I had it when I started,
Oh, I absolutely wish that I had stuff like this, because I have got to where I've gotten through just years of obsession and just reading about this compressor and that compressor, and then every chance I had try and compare them. But if someone could show me in a whole mix, this is what's doing this, that would have saved me probably years. So It does still take a long time to learn how to mix properly, but I think you can cut a lot of that out by having that knowledge presented to you, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think we live in an amazing era, because before this, all of us, the whole community that, teaches and try to and put information out there, it's it's a time. It was never. We never had this before. I never had this before. So, and that really cut the learning curve a lot. And the problem, on the other hand, is now there's a lot of crap out there, so it's hard to filter the good information from the not good information. But also, I think it's somewhat apparent who is maybe just a YouTuber or a real mixing engineer who actually does work and then happen to have a YouTube channel, as opposed to the other way around, with clickbait titles and regurgitated information. I think people are not stupid. You can tell, very easily. Sometimes it's a little bit hard because it's a matter of numbers, especially YouTube doesn't really reward the quality content, it just rewards the numbers. So it's a bit hard in that sense. Like I always I made a joke on my Facebook page some time ago, and I teach how to mix this extremely complicated, blah blah blah, and it's got 10,000 views, and then Metal Cats have 4 millions. But this is how YouTube works. Metal Cats will always win against what we do, because we are a niche. We teach a very specific subject, and it is the way it is what it is. But I still enjoy very much when people tell me hey, I bought your course and it was amazing. I learned so much. That's why we do it. That's why I do it.
Absolutely, it's definitely the reason that I do this. I mean, I was an engineer for many years before I got into doing the YouTube thing, and this is what I think we both get up in the morning and say, this is what I want to do with my life, and passing this knowledge on to other people is the best thing. Yeah,
it is. And do you leave a legacy which is going to be there? That a lot of people learn something from you. Doesn't matter how much or how little. If you get someone that tells you, hey, my mix has gotten better, or thank you because I was stuck on this for 2 years, and then I watched this and you explain it well. Or I have a lot of people, and this happens, unfortunately, I say, a lot. A lot of people telling me, I went to school and I paid X amount of money and I learned more in these 3 videos than in 4 years of school. This happened to me a lot. And and again, there are amazing schools out there, but there are also some that don't really, the teachers are not really in the trenches doing 200 mixes a year or 300 for a client. So you need to be up to date, you need to be fresh, you need to be sharp, you need to have fire up your ass to be able to be relevant and in this field, and you need to mix every day. That's what I tell most people, how do you do it? You just do it. You just wake up in the morning and do it every day. That's it. That's how you learn. How do you become strong at squatting? You squat every day. That's it.
Yeah.
There's no workaround.
That's right.
But yeah, I mean, you do have to just do it. You do have to just mix a lot. But having tools like this will absolutely. It's like anything. Proper technique doesn't make you great overnight, but it shortens the process a lot. You still have to do it, but if you do it right with tools like this, then you will absolutely
if you have a guide, it changes everything. If you have a guidance, if you know what the goal is, if you are presented with a bunch of options on how to go there, you can retain your style and decide which one I'm going to choose. Because someone can watch my course and say, you know what, I would have chosen the other compressor. And that's totally legit. That's the beauty of it. There's not one way to mix a song. There's not one way. There are a million ways. So I think the more options, the better. And creativity is all about creativity in this field. So yeah, definitely having a guide is like everything else. Having a guide, a mentor, call it the way you want, is shorten the time you take to learn something. And plus, in the course, you have the raw tracks, the same tracks that I used. Raw tracks, Pro Tools project, files, everything, plugin settings. So you really have a direct, and the way the course was filmed it was really like you are on a fly in the wall and just looking at me mixing. I'm blabbering when I'm mixing because of course I need to explain, but that's again, I wish I had it, when I started.
Fantastic. So if you are interested in David's course, the link is in the description below. It's going to be on sale for a short amount of time. It's going to be $47, which I think is entirely reasonable for several hours of work and all the Pro Tools sessions and everything else that goes with it. So check that out, link down below, and thank you so much, David, for coming on the channel and talking to us about this. It's very much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank to you, Adam, very much for having me. And of course, everybody, if you get the course, you have questions, come on my channel and ask questions. The comments are going to be bits and pieces from the course to give people an idea of what that is. And again, thank you so much for having me, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. And if you've not checked out MixbusTV, check out David's channel as well. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you in the next video. See you later. Hey everyone, that might be the end of the video, but if you fancy carrying on this conversation, we have a Discord server, link is in the description. We're also on Patreon, which is something you can really help us with. We also are on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter at Hot Pole Studios. See you there.